Okay, I guess I will get started. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming. We're really excited to have everyone here to support our undergraduate honors thesis students who are going to present to you today. My name is Amy Nan. I'm the Vice Chair of Undergraduate Studies this year, and welcome everyone to our annual event where we celebrate our honor students, and we also recognize and acknowledge everyone who's helped with our undergraduate education, and we'll be awarding our top anthropology awards at the end of the ceremony. So please be mindful, we are recording the session. Thank you for the reminder. So please keep your microphones muted when you're not speaking or presenting or asking a question, and try to keep the noise to a minimum. But of course, everyone, please unmute yourselves as we applaud, because it's always nice to have live applause if we can do that. Now that we're all used to Zoom after a year of doing this, that should be normal for everyone. So the format today is going to be 8 presentations, which is the most that I've hosted. So this is really exciting to have so many great speakers. Each speaker will speak for 12 to 15 minutes, hopefully leaving a few minutes for questions at the end. So feel free to add questions in the chat window throughout the talks or at the end of each talk. And I will either call on you if you'd like to ask your question, or I can read the questions out loud as we go at the end of each talk. And then there will be a few minutes at the end of all the talks where we can have a live question and answer session as well for anyone that might not have had time for questions at the end of their individual talk. So you can send me the questions privately in the chat or publicly to everyone. I'll moderate the Q&A in the chat. And I think that's it for formatting. So today I just want to introduce that we have 8 students speaking. Michael Murphy, Mariana Gomez Hernandez, Tian Quang Chen, Sophia Reyes, Yereni Reyes Medina, Chantel Rabe, and Anne-Marie Wart. And Eleni Carwin. I'm very proud of these students. They worked really hard this year. This is our first year of honors thesis students that have done their entire thesis remotely. Last year we presented remotely and we transitioned to remote partway through, but this year the entire thesis and the planning the year before was remote. So it's pretty tremendous feat that they have had such independence to do all of this from home and to do all the research and planning, and all of the mentors that have helped remotely. We are really grateful to all of your help as well. So without further delay, I'd like to get started because we've got lots of talks to hear today. So we're going to be.
You want to watch a little on your own?
Hey, Paul.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. That's typical for Zoom. Okay, so just a reminder, please mute yourselves. And I'm going to start by introducing our first speaker. Actually, I wanted to present this one slide before I introduce our first speaker. So let me open this. So here's my welcome slide. Welcome to all the undergraduate honors thesis presenters and our audience. And here is the beautiful poster that our class, and especially Mariana, created for us that we've shared with all of you by email, showing all of the 8 speakers and the titles of their talks. And we're going to start with the first one here, Michael Murphy, whose talk is entitled "A Kind of Weapons, Smuggled Activism from Cox's Bazaar." So join me in welcoming Michael, and I will allow you to share your screen now. And we'll start our first talk.
Thank you so much. Just a second here. All right, all good?
Yes, looks good. I will mute myself and you can begin.
Great, thank you so much. So again, my name is Michael Murphy. This project is entitled "A Kind of Weapons, Smuggled Activism from Cox's Bazaar." It's built on 1 year's worth of digital ethnographic fieldwork conducted for the honors thesis, as you probably know, under the mentorship of Dr. Rihan Ye. I want to give a content warning at the top. There is a discussion of ethnic cleansing and state violence in this presentation, and there will briefly be images of blood, bodies, and military arrests. So I began this project because I was curious about how refugees were constructing personas online and making use of social media during the COVID-19 pandemic. And this led me to documentary groups, which were being run by Rohingya refugees out of Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. So I'll have to give you some context on Rohingya before we go any further. The Rohingya people are a ethnic and religious minority. They've resided in Myanmar for over 1,000 years, but they have never been given official state citizenship. They've been systemically oppressed by the state of Myanmar, with limits put on their education, their freedom of movement, and their communication. For this presentation, that communication includes internet access as well, which I'll go into. In 2017, the majority of Rohingya were forcibly displaced from their home in Rakhine State in Myanmar over the border into Bangladesh, into the camps surrounding the city of Cox's Bazar. There are currently about 1 million refugees, Rohingya refugees, living in those camps around Cox's Bazar. This will be important later, but I want to point out that that military that pushed them out also just staged a coup this last February in Myanmar. So that'll be important later. When I started researching the social media coming out of Cox's Bazar, I was fascinated by how groups were using documentary methods like video, photography, poetry, and the actual platform of social media itself to accomplish a certain number of key points here. I'm going to use one social media post to sort of be a gateway to present those key points to you, which are that these documentary methods are a way for the Rohingya to represent themselves in international discourses instead of going through intermediaries like NGOs or the media. They're a way for them to claim the citizenship of Myanmar, which had been denied to them. And that this particular post uses themes of art, the selfie, and anonymity to force the viewer of it into the place of an activist. So I want to begin by drawing your attention to the bottom here, the caption of this post, kind of weapons with 2 little smiling emojis. And when we look at the photo here, we could easily think that the camera might be this weapon. There's certainly an argument to be made for that. This particular camera has captured a lot of important pictures. It's shot the entire flight from state violence, floods and fires that have decimated the camps. Those fires are actually thought to be arson by local Bangladeshis as well. It's documented the entire fight against the COVID-19 pandemic in the camps. And it also, every single day, captures images that humanize these Rohingya people, reminding us that they're not just a monolith or a pillar or some abstract concept of refugee, but people who are living their lives in these camps and in these situations. So if dissemination of that kind of information is the goal, then yeah, the camera is definitely one of the weapons, but the caption is plural, and I want to challenge you to look deeper. I think that's what those little grinning emojis are there for. So what other weapons might we see in this picture? For me, I see the camera is propped up on some books. And if we look closer at the books, we can see that one actually says writing composition in English. Essentially what we have here is language, a way to be understood, for them to write persuasive essays, to caption all of these social media posts and documentaries in English and other languages to be spread, a way for them to be understood. Language and communication is obviously a very useful tool in this activist effort. Another one, behind the camera and behind the books, is the computer. It's one of the very few computers in Cox's Bazar, and it's a lightning rod for ideas, for research, and for education. Entire classrooms take place around these computers. But remember that Rohingya had their access to education limited in Myanmar, so this is a huge opportunity for them and a great resource. One of my contacts even said, you know, I wanted to go to university, but I couldn't, and now Google is my university. In addition to education, whole social movements take shape around these computers. Entire documentary groups are organized around one solid laptop. And then online, they're also used to sort of pressure different groups like the UNHCR and UN on their responsibility to protect, Rohingya and refugees, and also to combat the coup that's taking place in Myanmar. You'll see the 3-fingered salute, which was made popular by Hunger Games and used in Hong Kong, is now being repurposed here. While we're talking about social connections, I also want to bring up the frame of this photo. It's the actual social media medium itself. Here it's Instagram, and using Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, these documentarians have been able to reach large audiences. And by the very nature of social media, their message has been passed around and repeated and reproduced to different audiences all the time. They're not just recording their lives for themselves and for social cohesion, they're presenting it to the world for a purpose. They're using social media right now to protest the coup in Myanmar and defend the very state that exiled them. Another content warning, here's the blood. So most recently, they've been reposting smuggled images, which have been shot between, window blinds and from far down the streets, images that could get people in a lot of trouble, get them arrested or disappeared. They've been reposting those images from the safety across the border and adding messages of resistance and solidarity. And I argue that by doing this, they're kind of becoming proxy citizens in Myanmar, claiming that citizenship that had been denied to them by standing shoulder to shoulder on this sort of digital front line and shouting with protesters in the streets of Yangon. And the interesting thing is, this is kind of working. Most recently, in the younger groups that are protesting this coup in Myanmar, Rohingya rights have been tied to the military violence against the entire state. And the Rohingya had been, systemically oppressed not just by the military and by the state, but by their neighbors as well. The non-Rohingya had a lot of vigilante terrorist acts against the Rohingya population throughout the years. So this was a persecuted population that, through these efforts, is now actually having their rights espoused by these large protests that are flooding the streets in conjunction with protests to the coup. I want to also draw your attention to the viewfinder. It's a small little detail that would probably get lost on a cursory glance, but one that we should look at. Here we can see the photographer who's taking a selfie with a cell phone. The cell phone, of course, is another tool, another weapon. It's connection to the internet anytime there's Wi-Fi. It's a backup camera that you can always have on hand, but it's also covering his face. And I think that anonymity is sort of a hidden weapon, a hidden tool in this post. When fear of state violence and cyber surveillance is ubiquitous, usernames and selective persona construction are incredibly useful tools in one's ability to say what you need to say with some modicum of protection. So altogether, we have this large cache of weapons, which are tools for creating narratives, constructing identities, documenting atrocities, disasters, and then projecting those documentaries out into the world. It's a way for the Rohingya to represent themselves on their own terms in dialogues with global bodies like the UN. And it also simultaneously allows them to claim some citizenship to Myanmar in this cooperative fight against an illegitimate government. There's one more thing that this post in particular does. I'm going to bring you back to the viewfinder. If we look at this as a selfie, the anonymity of it is a little haunting, isn't it? Myers claims that selfies are a way to say, I'm here, by placing the photographer directly into the context of the photo. And Guy says that they reflect a view of ourselves that we want to project out into the world, reading that they're a form of witnessing, which requires both seeing and then participating. So if selfies are used to say, I am here, then what happens when someone's face is obscured in it? The audience is automatically questioning who is there. And am I the only one who thinks that this looks a bit like a mirror when we look at it close? If, we look at the original photo, we are actually standing where the photographer is as he takes a selfie, looking out over the assembled weapons and the tools for creating these activist groups. So if the viewfinder is a mirror and the selfie is anonymous, and we're standing in the shoes of the photographer, then what if the photographer in this photo is just a blank canvas for us to see ourselves in? What if we, as the audience, are the final weapon? The camera, at this point, I realize, is looking through the screen at us expectantly. It doesn't just claim, I am here. It's looking at us and asking, why aren't you? We have the power to make the change here, so why aren't we? So in summary, Rohingya documentarians in Cox's Bazar have made extraordinary use of video, photo, art, language, and social media, not just to record their history as it's happening, but to speak about it in international discourses and to claim citizenship of Myanmar. This post in particular weaponizes the format of social media and the audience themselves, marshaling them to out of complacency and into action. Having just gone through a year of lockdown, we all seem more isolated and somehow more connected than ever. And A Kind of Weapons builds on that and builds on social media and documentary methods with an incredible ability to arrest and relocate the unsuspecting audience just scrolling through their feed as well as contributing to a bunch of literature on migrant teleco-presence. As I said, there are about 1 million Rohingya still living in Cox's Bazar. Every day, they continue to document and fight wars against COVID, against local arson, against the military junta online from across the border. And I want to thank them for their participation in this project, their mentorship, and their communication with me and with the world. I also want to thank Dr. Rihanye for her mentorship. I want to thank the Honors Thesis Program for the opportunity to do this research. One more time, I want to thank my partners in the field, and I would like to thank you all for your attention. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Everyone, can you unmute briefly? Fantastic, Michael. I think we have time for a couple of questions. You were very efficiently on time. So does anyone want to raise their hand or put a question in the chat? Suzanne?
Yeah, I just put one in the chat. I don't know if you want to read it or.
You can read it, sure.
Okay. Yeah, Michael, that's really interesting. I was wondering if you could tell us a little more about how you contacted the Rohingya activists and basically how they responded to you, and what kind of a sort of rapport you were able to establish with them.
Yeah, so as I sort of alluded to in the presentation, a lot of what the documentarians are producing is meant to go out to international audiences. They produce a lot of their work with English subtitles or in English just by default. So I saw a lot of the products of their documentary work and refugee Facebook groups initially. And so after kind of getting an idea of what that entailed, I reached out to a few of the producers, and many of them actually form coalitions that they just produce under the name of, so that they're not individually identifiable. So after a lot of back and forth and sort of validating, who we each were, I just sort of introduced this idea of the project that I was working on and asked them, if they would be interested in talking to me about what they're doing as documentarians, about their past and their histories in the last couple of years and state violence. And while I was doing all of this, a bunch of events actually happened in the camps that ended up becoming very useful for my work. And they were very, I think excited is a wrong word, but I can't think of the right word. They were very eager to share what was happening as it happened with me. So for instance, those arsons, the arson attacks were a big thing early in the work. And then the coup that just happened this last February became a huge flashpoint for activism. And, reaching out to international bodies was really one of the main goals that they had. So I think they saw me as part of that process, reaching out to academics and students abroad.
Thanks, Michael. I think we'll hold all the remaining questions for the Q&A at the end. Let's move on to our next speaker, which is Mariana Gomez Hernandez, and she will be speaking about crossing the line, states of exception at the US-Mexico border and beyond. Welcome, Mariana. You can go ahead and share your screen. Great. And get started whenever you're ready.
Okay. So hello, everyone. My name is Mariana Gomez Hernandez. My mentor was Dr. Rihanye as well, and this is my project, Crossing the Line, States of Exception at the US-Mexico border and beyond. So initially, the idea for this project was born a few months after my brother's arrest in February of 2020. So although the surveillance and policing of undocumented people had long been a potential topic for research of mine, it was not until my brother's own arrest that I was forced to come face to face with the ways in which policing and surveillance continue to permeate the lives of undocumented individuals. So this right here is a text message I received on the day of his release. It was sent from an automated system, and because I had not heard from him since his initial call to me at 3 a.m. of that same day, I felt a huge sense of relief. But after realizing that this automated system was likely created to make victims aware of their assailant's release, I immediately felt discomfort. And then soon after, I felt quite angry that I had been made to feel this way, that my brother had been created into someone I had to be warned about. So formed in part as an autoethnography and taking my own experiences as an undocumented individual, this project explores the effects of state-inflicted modes of surveillance and violence inflicted upon quote unquote illegal individuals. So through a series of interviews and a collection of drawings, a methodology I'll be returning to shortly, I arrived at three main findings. So the first is that the state/spaces of exception that form along the US-Mexico border also have the ability to be replicated elsewhere all across the nation. Second, the effects of the modes of surveillance that illegal immigrants are subjected to, both throughout their journey and their residence within the nation, are lifelong and span across generations. Third, and lastly, the surveillance and policing of illegal bodies have led to a huge mystification of the state, in which illegal persons have come to perceive it as an all-powerful, all-knowing, and generally unchallengeable entity. So in an attempt to visualize the experiences of undocumented migrants and to better illustrate to the outsider the depths to which these people are affected, I asked those I interviewed to draw a space that they related to immigration or their migratory experience in general. So here I'm drawing from Michael Tausig's book. I swear I saw this, drawings in fieldwork notebooks, namely my own. So even though within this book, he's using his own drawings, drawing from his own ethnographic work, I was intrigued by his view of drawings and their potential for revealing hidden parts of one's perspective. So as we begin to explore a series of themes, we will be discussing quotes from interviews and one drawing in particular. It should be noted that all names mentioned from here onward are pseudonyms. So beginning with this state/space of exception and its relation to the illegal immigrants, philosopher Giorgio Agamben described it as a space in which the law is suspended by the governing and sovereign authorities of a nation state. So in other words, the law becomes suspended by the law itself. And it is the law who has the right to decide when, where, and who to subject to such a suspension of the law, just as it has the right to enforce it. So a pretty straightforward example of this is the 100-mile Constitution-free zone. Within this area, Border Patrol and ICE agents are granted the ability to act outside of the Fourth Amendment. As a result, individuals in these regions are no longer assured the right to, quote, be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures, end quote. So that variability for the law to decide on its own suspension is something that is replicated in areas well beyond this 100-mile zone. These spaces of exception serve as a way to convey the state's power, as they allow state actors to harass, violate, and otherwise abuse all those the state has made vulnerable. So during an interview with one of my interlocutors, Esmeralda, she describes to me an incident that took place while being detained. So here she says, it is very hard for one because they beat you vaginally without knowing if you have problems or not, they don't care. And they hit your private parts, and if you tell them it hurts, they don't care. The blows, whether they hurt or not, that is the hardest and most difficult thing that one can go through. At the borderline, they treat you like a criminal. So in addition to this blatant abuse of power that Esmeralda was subjected to, it is important to highlight her own assigned role within this narrative. So during the interaction described, Esmeralda took on the role of a quote unquote criminal. In this discussion of the state of exception, Agamben also describes Homo Sacer, the sacred man. So the sacred man is a figure that finds himself both inside and outside of the law. Through his very exclusion of the law, he also comes to form a part of it. Similarly, through Esmeralda's experience and her role as a quote unquote criminal, she was both rejected and entrapped by the state. The inherent illegality of undocumented individuals forces them into a perpetual state of liminality, in which their exclusion on part of the judicial system is at once the very force that renders them vulnerable to the state's surveilling and policing. So through this categorization of undocumented people as quote unquote illegal, the border and the spaces of exception that form beyond it become bound onto the individual. And it is in this way that the border becomes a portable entity. So this notion is reflected in the long-lasting fear and anxiety around being detained that is often experienced by migrants. So here, Martha told me, all the authority here, all of it, they all cause you fear. Because any little thing that one does wrong, one already thinks they're going to take you. That does not end. When you get a ticket, they can deport you for not having been born here. even if you have citizenship and everything. So that's why we've been good. There are those that haven't been, but one respects the authority. So this ability for spaces/states of exception to form and the ability of the border to become bound onto immigrant bodies is rooted in panoptic-like modes of surveillance, which seek to surveil and monitor the movement of immigrant bodies. So taking the 287G program as an example of this, this is a program where state and local law enforcement officers are able to investigate immigration cases and make immigration arrests on behalf of federal authorities. So even though this program is not implemented nationwide, where it is implemented, the ways in which it is enforced vary drastically. This creates different categories of deportees, and most importantly, a confused sense of fear on part of undocumented individuals who are often unsure of the abilities and rights of the police officers in their local area. So despite this program not being enforced in California, an area where most of my interlocutors reside in, almost half of those I spoke with did indeed believe that police officers had the right to defer them to immigration. So this potential for punishment that is implied by programs like the 287G, whether they be enforced in someone's local area or not, then become a punishment in and of itself. Programs like these contribute to that cult of fear that surrounds the state and its perception as an all-powerful entity. So the impact of these sorts of surveillance modes can be seen in the generational trauma that often takes hold of immigrant families. I spoke to quite a few US born citizens who, despite having citizenship, still express feelings of anxiety or fear around Border Patrol or ICE agents. All of these were children of people who were or were at one point undocumented. So here we can see a timeline depicting every significant event of someone I spoke with from my own family, my cousin Berta. So in 1999 is when her mother first migrated to the United States. Shortly after, in 2001, Berta was born. In 2010, her mother travels back to to Mexico to see her dying mother, returning an estimated 10 months later, also through quote unquote illegal methods. In 2012, Berta witnesses the deportation of her father, which she describes as a pivotal point for her and her family. It should be noted that her father remains in Mexico to this day. And in 2019, Berta enters her freshman year in college, where she says she was often questioned about her legal status by peers and professors alike. So clearly we can see how the forms of surveillance and violence that have been inflicted upon her parents have directly affected Berta. We can only assume the sorts of effects that these have had and the lifelong traumas that these will result in. So, and additionally, that constant questioning of her legal status point to how Berta herself is still seen as an outsider within the American polity. She described to me feeling anxious and uneasy around ICE and Border Patrol because even though she is a citizen, she also had this perception of the state as being able to do whatever it wanted. So these forms of generational trauma, along with the replication of the state/space of exception, have contributed to a huge mystification of the state, where it is perceived by many as being an all-powerful, all-knowing, and unchallengeable entity. So as I observed Marta draw this drawing here, she told me her story, which in many ways felt akin to a fairy tale. The state and its actors acted as the evil and extremely powerful beings. The power that they had felt almost magical. They could sense your fear. They could tell if you were lying. That incredible lucidity that is conveyed through these drawings supports the notion that these memories, or rather traumas, are long-lived and vividly remembered. The drawings, Marta's in particular, helps to visualize these fears felt by undocumented individuals. Here we see a frenzied scribble of pathways, a looming watchtower, and a helicopter scouting for trespassers. Drawings like these, paired with the numerous descriptions of the anxiety and fear felt by migrants, show the ways in which this perception of the state as an entity with almost supernatural abilities has impacted the way in which migrants behave and perceive their surroundings. So it should be noted that despite all of this fear and anxiety, undocumented immigrants have sort of learned how to disguise themselves as citizens, or in other words, as people who really have no reason to fear these sort of federal entities. So just as undocumented travelers duck behind bushes and crawl under fences in their journey to the United States, once immersed within the nation, they learn to mask their illegality through this confident nonchalance. These, quite simply, are methods of survival in which the individual subjected to that constant surveillance and monitoring is able to shield certain parts of themselves that might signal to their illegality. And these methods of survival have, for so many, including my own family, allowed people to lead relatively normal lives. In my own family, for example, this might mean saving up to get a quote unquote good car to avoid getting pulled over, or simply enjoying the right to exist within any given space. This is an ability that should not be overlooked, as it points to that relentless determination to exist in a space where we are deemed as illegal. So on February 28th of 2020, just a week after my brother's arrest, I volunteered at the conference, Counter Technologies at Edgelands, where I introduced multiple panel speakers. This conference centered around the militarization of the borderlands and the ways in which immigrants or otherwise racialized bodies are policed and surveilled. This conference was a cross-border event, meaning that one of the days was centered here in the US and the other took place in Tijuana, Mexico. So attending this conference while my own family had been struggling to deal with the aftermath of my brother's arrest felt very intense, to say the least. But it also felt like a strike of hope, because although the border has itself turned into a portable entity that has become embodied in the bodies of migrants, there are those of us who are still mobile, right? So this conference was made up of speakers from multiple parts of California and Tijuana, and it was full of community members, activists, scholars, and academics who came together to speak about the complexities of being immobile, and that we can better engage in discourses of surveillance and violence. So in a moment where I was feeling incredibly overwhelmed by my own private experiences, it felt, for lack of a better term, extremely comforting to know that others cared. In many ways, that is what I am trying to do here, to contribute to that discourse and let members of my own family and members of my community to inform them that they are being cared for, that they matter. So before I wrap up, I do want to extend a huge thank you to my mentor, Dr. Li Hanye. She encouraged me to move forward with this project when I had my doubts, and I'm very glad to have done so. I also want to thank Dr. Amy Nan, who helped us during such unprecedented times, and to my friends and family for their unconditional support, and most importantly, to my interlocutors who trusted me with their stories. I can only hope that I have done enough to make them feel heard. Thank you.
Fantastic job, Mariana. Really powerful speech. Does anyone want to ask a question? I think we have time for one question. Might take some reflection, and you could put your questions in the chat for later as well. I don't see everybody on the screen. Let me make sure. Okay, well, I think we are just speechless with how fantastic these talks are. So we will reflect on them and come up with some questions and ask them at the end. So let's move on to our next speaker. So we have a third sociocultural student who is speaking today on ethnographic study on Chinese international students in the US during the pandemic. Let's welcome Tianquang Chen. Tianquang, do you want to share your screen?
Okay, wait a second. Sorry.
Great.
And like, okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Tianquang Chen, and today my topic is the year of. Sorry, like I have to readjust the windows. Sorry.
Take your time.
Okay. Yeah. Hello, my name is Tianquang Chen, and today I will present the Year of the Rat, Year of the Pandemic. It's an ethnographic study on Chinese international students in the US during the pandemic. And this project is overseen by Professor David Jordan. And like to starting with, I will just introduce the background of the Chinese international student population, both in the US and as a culture in China. So at the very beginning, this culture of studying abroad was originated in 1980s, which is the open door policy launched by Chinese government, and with the joining of the neoliberal economy of China, to study abroad become a way of investment for many parents and
¿Cuánto dura? 37. ¿Está bien? ¿Está bien? Sí. Okay.
Sorry, like the voice.
Sí, normalmente.
Okay, like to study abroad become a way of investment for many parents, especially many middle-class parents in China, which they believe that the higher education of overseas universities will guarantee their kids a brighter future. And to study abroad gradually became an industry in China, which includes the industry of taking the test to the preparation of college applications. And this photo is the SAT test center in Hong Kong, like, which is a huge test center and can contain more than 10 or 20,000 people to take the test at the same time, which can show the like the gratitude or the of this industry in China. Oh, sorry. So like the Chinese international students in the US is a continuously growing population. So like in 2013, there's about 300,000 Chinese students enrolled in the US universities. And the number now is more than 370,000 students. So like even just in our college, UCSD, there are more than 5,000 Chinese international students, which makes up like 14% of the entire student body and about 60% of the entire international student body. So like the Chinese international students studying overseas, especially in the US, are facing different problems. For example, the language barrier. Chinese students, they often learn English as the second language and as a tool. Therefore, although they can pass the TOEFL exam or the IELTS exam, which is designed to show the proficiency of English second language speakers, but they are lack of the knowledge and understanding of English speaking societies, which make their especially the first year in the US colleges more difficult. And the cultural differences is another point that Chinese students may face these kind of challenges. The first is the image of self. For Chinese students, the image of the self is more related to the group that they have been in this from elementary school to high school. That they are always like be connected with the group, with their own class. But in the US, the image of self is more individual. So which means that the Chinese students studying in the US may face these kind of problems, such as the problem of socialization and also the problem of the self-identity. And also, Chinese students tend to be more introverted, which means that they are not like outgoing as other. They are not in a very outgoing environment in the US, in China. So like when they move to the US, they will face different problems of like the during making friends or joining the social activities. And about the COVID-19 pandemic. This COVID-19 pandemic is absolutely changing everything on Earth, and especially for Chinese international students, they are in a very special position, which at the boundary of their host and home countries. So maybe they are more vulnerable toward all these changes. And because of the COVID-19 pandemic, just in the US, there are a lot of changes of policies, such as the changes of visa status, and also the changes of, for example, the administrative letter signed by President Trump, which doubting the Chinese students are spies trying to steal the new technology in the US. And all these dialogues on the international society have complicated the Sino-American relationship, which further give more burden on these Chinese international students who are studying in the US or who want to study in the US in the future. So according to the US Department of State, there's a dramatic drop of F1 student visas granted to Chinese students. This number in 2019 is about like 100,000 F1 visas, but like just in 2020, from March to November, this number was less than 1,500. So like, which is a 98% decrease. And this study is trying to examine new and pressing issues faced by Chinese international students, including their disillusionment of studying abroad, the competing pressure on academic performance, and the challenge of isolation that they may have arisen due to the pandemic. So basically, in this project, I adopt two methods. The first one is ethnographic interviews, and I interviewed 10 Chinese international students via online Zoom meetings, and three of them are in Chinese mainland right now, and 7 of them are in the US. And all of them are using pseudonyms. And the second part is the outer ethnography, studying the Chinese New Year. And I spent with my friends for about a month during the Chinese New Year this year. So like in California, the schedule of the schedule of the quarter is always conflicting with the Chinese New Year. So actually, I haven't been home for about 3 years during the Chinese New Year. And this year is the year of ox. So like people say that this year could be the year of change, because that the last year people have suffered a lot from all these pandemic things, and they're hoping for a new change or a new chance to get move on, to get rid of the pandemic. Which means that this the year of ox gives the Chinese New Year new meanings. And although the Chinese international students are now used to the exigencies brought by the virus, such as the isolation and online educating, but all these exigencies are still exigencies, which are not the normal status. And Chinese students, they are celebrating the Chinese New Year properly because of that. They are also wanting to anchor the normality by celebrating this traditional Chinese festival. So like it is a photo taken in my friend's house, which we celebrate the Chinese New Year Eve. So at that time, I said that I think it's okay. We need this feeling. So like, although all these decorations seems to be more kind of exaggerated or kind of too much, but I think this kind of decoration do have the effect of anchoring the normality and reminding us that we have these festivals and we have these normal days that we can celebrate. So during the research of during the interviews, there are 3 main topics appeared, which are the problem of online learning, the issue of loneliness, and the disillusionment and changing plans of Chinese international students. So the first is the problem of online learning. So every students now have made the adjustment to the new online environment, but the efficiency of study is one common issue they faced. So one informant said that the flexibility and freedom of online learning bring the problem of self-control, which means that because we have moved all this education, all these courses online, so we can decide by ourselves that when should we turn the assignments, or what is the progress of our projects. That means that it's inevitably we face these challenges of self-control inevitably, because we don't have the normal checking by offline classes. And for example, like just in my own cases, during the whole process of writing the thesis and creating and doing the project, I was somehow like always a little bit behind the progress, just because like I'm thinking that just before the deadline, I still have time to do that, or I just can do all my project at home. So like there's no sense of like tension in my own living room. So. And the second problem is for students of online education, is for students in China right now. So in China, there's a great firewall which prevents the use of all Google products, the use of YouTube, the use of Facebook in China physically. So that these students back in China, they are not able to access to all these products, and they have to use the VPN as a kind of way to connect to access to the course materials and to take the class. And it inevitably just decrease the efficiency of their learning process and giving them more difficulties while trying to keep up with the class. And another issue for students living in China right now is the time differences. So like normally there's a 12-hour to 14-hour time difference between China and the US. So like for the class a day in the US, many of students in China have to take this kind of class at even 3 a.m. at the morning. So like which greatly disrupt their daily schedules and giving them more both stress and mental burdens on their daily life. The second point is the issue of loneliness. These Chinese students are facing the issue of loneliness like everyone else, like now because of the pandemic, because of the isolation. But but comparatively, their families are, for the students living in the US right now, their families are far away from them, and it's due to the physical distance and also the time difference. Their communication might be more difficult. But it's not the only issue of loneliness faced by these students. As Chinese international students, these people, like, they are facing communal challenges brought by this identity. So here is a videotape recorded during the pandemic, and it's showing the Chinese international students came from Italian in China during the quarantine, shouting at the police, saying that she wants like purified water and more better conditions of the quarantine hotel. So we can see the video right now.
我现在警告你，口头警告你：第一，这里不是宾馆，懂吗？不是宾馆。第二，现在是医学中心这边隔离区，现在隔离区有保障人权吧？我们现在你要这边通知他们的工作人员都要。他们完全不配合啊！你现在要全部就是听从这边的，而不是说你。但是我3天没有喝水了，你能接受3天不喝水？水给你了吗？没有啊。怎么没有给你？水在哪？有水说他工作人员都说了，你要喝矿泉水。 要把快递寄过来，这不是你家里现在，懂吗？但是我现在警告一遍，我现在跟你很正，我这边是普通话的啊，不是什么医生。我先跟你讲啊，如果你下次还有这种情况，我会采取法律措施的啊，就是强制性把你带走。
You have 1 minute.
那有个人不吃饭怎么回事？你所有的东西都会有工作人员替。
Yes. So like actually this video of like the international student arguing with the police, it just ignited all the angers toward Chinese international students on Chinese social media. And it created an image of Chinese international students as ungrateful and spoiled kids from rich families. And that saying that these students are just they just want to enjoy the privilege of Chinese citizens, but do not refuse to take the duties and responsibilities. So that as Chinese international students, so like on the side of host countries in the US, there are a lot of dialogues about like Chinese virus or many hate speech toward them. But like when they come home, they are also facing this kind of hostility and malice from social media, and which definitely creates a sense of betrayal that when they want to search for help in their home country, they just get these kind of sarcasm and criticisms. And many of my informants, they have quote this traditional Chinese saying that like it's a pixie looking at the mirror. So like at the picture right here, you can see it's a hawk monster looking at the mirror, which means that whether inside the mirror or outside, he's not a human being. So like it's just like the Chinese international students, both in their host country or home country, they're not welcome and well treated. And that's one major source of the loneliness these Chinese international students are facing right now. So the third part is the disillusionment and changing plans of Chinese international students. During the interview, like one student just said that, which is very impressive to me, that it is the US, not heaven. So like it shows a kind of attitude that they know what's happening in the US, and they are somehow get used to this kind of attitude. But also like it also shows that their recognition of all these challenges and difficulties in this country. So almost everyone has his or her own considerations, and all my informants, they said that their plans of education and plans or future job plans are definitely disrupted by this pandemic. And some of them are still like stay in the US and continue their educations. But some of them are thinking that they're gonna just leave the US and go back to China to find new opportunities. And still, some of my informants, they are still thinking about current situations and about like the situations they are facing and their future plans. To conclude with, like in this COVID-19 pandemic, Chinese international students studying in the US, they face not only common difficulties brought by the pandemic, but also extra challenges related to their special identities, such as obstacle of technology, politicization of their identity, and the sense of exclusion from the mainstream society. So as a result, this unique experience makes Chinese international students change their perspectives on both their host and home countries and reconsider their goals in education and possible future plans. And I'd like to thank my director, Professor David Jordan. And he gives me the title of Year of the Rat, Year of the Pandemic, which is, I like it very much, and it's a very suitable title. And I'd like to thank Professor Amy Nam. She gave all of us in this project many help and guidance during the writing of the thesis and also while conducting the projects. And I will thank all my interlocutors, 10 of my informants, like who are currently receiving my invitation and trusting me and providing all these materials and informations. And thanks to all my peers and all of you come to this meeting today. Thank you.
Thank you, Tian Quang. That was excellent. We are over time, so we'll hold questions until the end of the session, but really, yeah, definitely eye-opening, definitely insightful. Thank you so much. Let's move on. To our next speaker, we have a fourth sociocultural student, Sophia Nezahualcoyotl Reyes. Sophia, are you here?
Yes, I'm here. I'm gonna start sharing my screen. Let me know if you are able to see everything.
Everyone is doing amazing today. Thank you all. Looks good.
So all of you are able to see it, correct?
Yes.
Okay, just want to make sure. And can you hear me well? Just
Yeah.
sound check. So good morning, everyone. I am Sophia Reyes, a third-year sociocultural anthropology student. And the topic of my thesis is Saint Death and the Virgin, Faith and Crisis in Modern Mexico. And this thesis is an exploration of the roles that La Virgen de Guadalupe and Santa Muerte, who's a newer folk saint that's recently emerged in Mexico in the past 2 decades, how these two figures interact and the role they play in Mexican society, particularly to Mexican women. So this is an excerpt from my abstract for this thesis. In the past few decades, Santa Muerte, which translates literally as Saint Death, has been gaining popularity amongst members of the marginalized classes in Mexico. She is typically represented as a female skeleton dressed as a bride, or often in garments similar to the Virgin Mary. And Santa Muerte has been condemned by state and church authorities as a narco saint, which is basically a term for a figure used by drug cartels to offer sacrifice to in order for them to commit crimes. However, according to ethnographic data, this is not necessarily the case. While there are some Santa Muerte devotees which are connected to organized crime, many of them are marginalized Mexicans, and especially women who use her as a source of protection in a very political environment. She's often been positioned in literature as a rival to La Virgen de Guadalupe, who is the national patroness of Mexico, and a figure who is venerated both by secular authorities and by church authorities. My main claim in this thesis is that in spite of their differences, both Santa Muerte and Guadalupe's appeal lies in their role as champions of the marginalized, and their female identity allows them to have a special significance to female devotees. So methods for this thesis, I did analyze a wide variety of ethnographic material. The two scholars pictured on the right are Dr. Andrew Chestnut and Dr. Kate Kingsbury, who have done extensive research with both Guadalupanos, devotees of the Virgin of Guadalupe, and devotees of Santa Muerte. For this thesis, I mainly combed through ethnographic records, interviews with devotees in Mexico, and tried to pick out common themes and analyze the main reasons for why devotees find these figures appealing. So for some background info, I'm going to give you some quick historical background about each of the two figures. So who is La Virgen de Guadalupe? The Virgin of Guadalupe is a Marian apparition, most commonly referred to by her Mexican followers as La Virgen, which is what I will be referring to her during this presentation. She's considered canonical by the Catholic Church and has been declared the patroness of the Americas. And throughout Mexican history, she's been used for a variety of different political causes, and she is genuinely well respected as like a symbol of Mexican national pride. Many of her devotees self-identify as Catholic, and her basilica at Tepeyac remains the most visited Catholic pilgrimage site in the world, attracting millions of visitors per year. So one important thing that Santa Muerte and Guadalupe share is their religiously syncretic origins. Religious syncretism refers to the practice of different religious traditions being merged either through colonialism or different types of cultural mixing. These three images are pre-Columbian deities that La Virgen was believed to have been based off of. On the left, you have the Aztec Earth Mother, Coatlicue, and in the middle, you have an unknown unidentified Aztec deity, but many female deities were referred by the moniker Tonantzin, which roughly translates to our beloved mother. So at the time of the Spanish conquest, La Virgen's devotees were indigenous people who spread the word that she had appeared to an indigenous person. And at the time, Spanish authorities were suspicious of this because they believed that the indigenous people were using the image of the Virgin Mary to mask their devotion to these so-called heathen pre-Columbian religious figures. And there still is a lot of debate about which Aztec or Nahuatl goddess she was modeled after, but it is generally believed that it is the Earth Mother or Tonantzin, as she's generally attributed with maternal qualities. So she's, as I mentioned earlier, La Virgen has been co-opted by a wide variety of political movements in Mexico. Here we just have a couple of the different movements who have used her image. As you may know, not all of these movements are spiritual in nature. Some of them were very political. And a general theme among individuals who used her for political causes throughout Mexican history is that she's often associated with like a marginalized underclass of Mexican citizens, which includes indigenous people and the poor. Like, for instance, during the Mexican independence movement, Miguel Hidalgo, who was a priest, put images of her on his banners, and his rallying cry translates to "Long live La Virgen de Guadalupe and death to the Gauchupines," which refers to Spanish-born elites who did not have indigenous heritage and who often were oppressive towards indigenous people in the region. So in testimonies of the Guadalupanos that I analyzed, many of the ethnographers who I analyzed for this project, the testimonies were gathered from pilgrims traveling to La Virgen's Mexico City shrine on her feast day. These pilgrimages are often organized by women in conjunction with parish authorities. So it's a very female-focused movement, firstly, for obvious reasons, since La Virgen is a maternal deity and therefore she has a very special significance to women. In testimonies, one common theme is that pilgrims often emphasize La Virgen's capacity to act as a maternal figure and perform acts of healing. Almost all of the testimonies of pilgrims were saying that they traveled to La Virgen's Basilica to give thanks for her act of either healing them or healing one of their relatives. So these are some quotes from pilgrims from the ethnography that I analyzed that sort of emphasize that she's viewed as like a universal mother and also as like a mother of the Mexican people. The last quote here, that's why she's so important, particularly to sectors of Mexico who are marginalized. She's a symbol of dignity and affirmation of a people whose lives and religions are questioned. And the symbolic significance of Guadalupe is especially made apparent in this quote because as the mother of God, she is believed to have come to the indigenous people and reminded them and said, "You too are children of God and you too deserve rights," which at the time, the Spanish colonizers did not believe indigenous people had the capacity to reason or that their own religious traditions had value. So she's sort of a symbol of the validity of indigenous lifeways, and also she's a validator of the mestizo identity, which is a category of mixed race Mexicans who share both Spanish and indigenous heritage. So Santa Muerte is a folk saint who's often positioned as a rival to La Virgen. La Virgen has been around for roughly 500 years. And Santa Muerte's origins are less certain. She became mainstream in 2001, although there are references, some documents referencing her going back to the 18th century. There is a document from a Spanish friar referencing how a group of Chichimex Indians had to be basically dispersed because they were worshiping a skeletal figure called Santa Muerte. And so as a result of religious suppression, it's believed that folk practices relating to her worship went underground. She has been condemned by both secular and religious authorities for being a narco saint. And in fact, in the late 2000s, the president of Mexico at the time, Felipe Calderón, declared her religious enemy #1, and he ordered all her shrines along the US-Mexico border to be bulldozed. In spite of this condemnation of Santa Muerte as a figure associated with crime. In the ethnography I examined, devotees generally see Santa Muerte devotion as compatible with their Catholicism. As one says, we are Catholic, but in a different way. So again, like La Virgen, Santa Muerte has syncretic indigenous roots. It's believed that she was modeled after Mictacihuat, who was the Aztec goddess of the underworld. Often, Santa Muerte is sort of dressed in this sort of Marian style. So as you can see, the style of dress and the worship is very reminiscent of La Virgen, but at the same time, it has those pre-Columbian roots and the reference to indigenous spirituality. So Tepito, Mexico City is, it's a region of Mexico City, a neighborhood specifically where Santa Muerte first came to prominence. The so-called madrina, or the godmother of Santa Muerte devotion, is a woman called Enriqueta Romero, who was a quesadilla vendor who lived in the area. And in 2001, she decided to make Santa Muerte devotion public by creating a public shrine to the saint outside of her quesadilla stand. And Enriqueta has emphasized that while she did bring the saint to public knowledge, she is not the leader of the religion. She doesn't like being called the madrina of the Santa Muerte cult, because as she says, Santa Muerte is for everyone. There is no need for priests and churches. And this is one of the reasons why devotion to Santa Muerte is considered threatening to the state, because it sort of defies those hierarchies of ecclesiastical authority. And it's mainly a movement that occurs among ordinary people and not through like the traditional vehicle of the Catholic Church. So Santa Muerte is what we call a folk saint. And there's a couple characteristics of folk saints which I felt I needed to outline before I get into more examination of the ethnography, since many may not be familiar with the concept. Folk saints are very common in Mexico. And unlike traditional saints of the Catholic Church, they're not canonized or they're not recognized. And in the case of Santa Muerte, they may even be openly condemned. A folk saint is basically an ordinary Mexican citizen who during their lifetime became glorified for certain deeds or certain actions. Unlike canonical Catholic saints, folk saints can become deified for secular deeds. So most Catholic saints become saints because of their conformity to Catholic doctrine or their so-called like theological works, while folk saints can become deified for other reasons. The most interesting aspect of folk saints and the most relevant for this thesis is that they often exhibit morally transgressive qualities. So in the writing portion of my thesis, I did briefly examine these two folk saints, San Jesus Malverde and Santa Teresa de Cabora. And these two figures are folk saints like Santa Muerte, and they're relatively popular in Mexico, although they are not as popular as Santa Muerte. What I want to emphasize here is that both of them were involved in secular activities that were considered transgressive by the state at the time. For example, Malverde was a bandit, and he broke the law by robbing Sinaloa elites and distributing their wealth to the poor. He was sort of a Robin Hood-like figure, and he was actually executed by the state for this for his crimes. But his grave site became a site of veneration for locals. And he's generally revered as somebody who was like a champion of the poor and a champion of justice. In a similar manner, Santa Teresa was a mystic who was said to possess healing powers, and she was an advocate for indigenous rights. And in the region she was operating at the time, once again, under the Diaz dictatorship, local indigenous groups began to rebel against the government, and she was blamed for inciting violence and basically forced into exile in the United States. So these two figures, while they are revered by ordinary Mexicans, are partaking in these acts of illegality, but it's precisely for these acts like inciting rebellion and stealing from corrupt elites that they become so beloved amongst ordinary people. So going into testimonies of Santa Muertistas, which is what Santa Muerte's followers call themselves, the testimonies that I examined were collected by ethnographers from devotees either traveling to her shrine in the Tepito neighborhood of Mexico City or amongst female devotees in rural Oaxaca. Among Guadalupanos, the vast majority of devotional efforts are spearheaded by women. For example, as I mentioned earlier, Enriqueta Romero is believed to be like the founder of Santa Muerte's religion, and many other women in various regions of Mexico are responsible for basically evangelizing Santa Muerte and telling other people about her, since she is still a fringe folk saint. So the saint is generally conceptualized by her devotees as an alternative to faulty systems of government and ecclesiastical authority. So one important thing, it's impossible to analyze Santa Muerte or La Virgen in modern Mexico without addressing the idea or the crisis of the drug war. The casualties of the drug war are extremely relevant to Santa Muerte's devotees, as many of them live in regions that are fraught with political violence. These are just some statistics about the large number of casualties and violence that has occurred in regards to the drug wars. One of the most important statistics here is the 1,481 femicides. Femicides are basically gender-motivated killings of women that often happen in areas where there is lots of like narcotics trafficking. And in the vast majority of these cases, only 1.6% of documented cases result in convictions. So there's a deliberate neglect of women who go missing or are murdered by drug cartels by the state, either because of just neglect or there's pressure not to investigate the disappearances of these women. And this becomes especially relevant when talking about the women who venerate Santa Muerte and why. So two special terms that Santa Muerte and La Virgen's devotees use are amparo, protection, versus desamparo, loss of protection. What's especially interesting about the term amparo is that it's actually a term used in the Mexican legal system to refer to the deferment of a sentence. And in the case of Santa Muerte, a lot of her devotees view death or the possibility of a premature violent death as the result of political instability as part of like this desamparo, like they're losing protection because the state no longer is able to prevent them from having a premature death. So these are some quotes from the ethnographies, interviews with Santa Muerte devotees. And I think one of the most significant ones here, which I highlighted, is the only thing I have ever asked for is protection from the violence that surrounds us. You may also notice here that there's themes of the idea of like how death is the only thing that is certain. Like this woman here who says, I venerate La Santa because the only thing certain is death. And I know for certain that death exists and I'm just paying my respects to it. So in an environment such as neoliberal Mexico, where there is violence from cartels and there is political instability, a lot of devotees of Santa Muerte embrace her as sort of a protective mechanism from violent death. So by embracing this image of death, they're able to ward off the possibility that they may have a premature death themselves. And as some scholars have noticed, this is pretty indicative of how cynical certain Mexicans feel about their government, where they feel like the only thing they can trust is the idea of, you know, eventual mortality because the environments they live in are so dangerous. So Santa Muerte, as I mentioned earlier, functions sort of like a psychological replacement for many systems that some Mexicans feel have failed them, such as the government. So in terms of the government, which is unable to deliver justice, basically to drug cartels and to individuals like who are harmed by them, Santa Muerte, in her role as death, is able to be a sort of equalizer and ensure that justice is carried out. Like in these two quotes, we see, I love Santa Muerte because of her great fairness and unpredictability. Death can come at any time and eventually does come to all, rich or poor. Mexico, despite being the second largest economy in Latin America, is also the most unequal. There's a wide gap between the rich and the poor. And because of the current drug war, often the most impoverished citizens are the ones most likely to go missing or be subject to premature death. So in this case, we see how they use Santa Muerte, knowing they won't be protected by the state, as a replacement for regardless of whether the state is able to deliver justice to them if they're harmed by members of drug cartels, they know that eventually everyone dies, and therefore that's sort of like a palliative justice.
Hey, Sophia, we're out of time. Can you jump to the conclusion?
Sure. So I have a lot left.
Can you jump to the conclusion and just give us an overview? We're 5 minutes over.
So mainly, the main thing in my thesis that I wanted to emphasize is that Santa Muerte and her role as a deliverer of justice is relatable to women because many of them live in environments that are plagued by gendered violence. And Santa Muerte, unlike La Virgen, who's usually displayed in a more passive way, is an active deliverer of justice. And she encompasses both the qualities of a maternal figure and a fearsome warrior, which is what is relatable to many Mexican women. And this was just future research, and any questions or comments?
Thanks, Sophia. Sorry to cut you. Really fantastic. Clearly you have a lot to share, and maybe we'll have time to get at that in the Q&A. Thank you. Please, everyone, provide your questions into the chat window, and we'll come back to them at the end. And also, speakers, just try to keep your eye on the clock or on the chat window as I send you time messages to keep you on track. Okay, next speaker, we're gonna shift gears quite a bit and jump to our biological anthropology students. And we'll start with Yereni Reyes Medina, who's gonna speak to us about stigma and mental health effects in the COVID and HIV pandemics. So let's welcome Yereni.
Hi everyone, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Let me share my screen. Okay, so hi everyone, my name is Yareni and my pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a bioanthrop major and graduating senior here at UCSC. And my topic is stigma and the mental health effects of HIV and the COVID pandemic. My mentor was Dr. Nan. And as a preview, I just want to start by saying that this project was kind of inspired by another research project that I conducted this same year regarding the experiences of people living in the border region of Mexico. So I'm very interested in the people back in Mexico. So this is why I decided on this topic. So first, I would like to start with statistics. So as of early May, there were 32 million cases of COVID reported in the United States. This number has kept on growing by the minute, and it shows the importance of studying topics related to COVID. More statistics. So Latinos are specifically hurt by COVID. So 1.7 times they are more likely to contract COVID than white people, 4.1 times more likely to be hospitalized, and 2.8 times more likely to die. Since vaccines recently started, there's only 12% of the US population that are Latinos that have been vaccinated against COVID-19. So my research project is surrounded in two main research questions. So how does stigma among Latina women during the COVID pandemic compares with stigma among people living with HIV? And how does stigma within Latina women associate with mental health outcomes? So in order to do so, I looked at two main studies. So my HIV study was Dos Santos study that studied South African people living with HIV. They were both men and women from 4 different cities: Gauteng, Northwest, Mpumalanga, and Limpopo. And they used the PL-HIV stigma index to measure trends related to stigma and discrimination. They were asked about their experiences with stigma, having children, their access to work, health and education treatment and care. And in comparison, I also used the MUM study, which was a Latina women cohort from San Diego. They were 166 immigrant mothers from a women's health clinic in San Diego. And they were all in their first trimester of pregnancy when they were first surveyed at the beginning of COVID. Because it was the beginning of COVID and none of them had had COVID since, it was an anticipatory stigma scale compared to the other one. And the variables in the mom study that I analyzed included both anticipatory stigma and open-ended questions. So I also used psychosocial variables. So I looked at discrimination, acculturation, years in the US at baseline, and mental health outcomes, including depression and anxiety. And my open-ended questions were, what is your biggest concern for your children during the pandemic? And can you please describe your fears of getting tested because of your documentation status? And so this first table shows the anticipatory stigma results from the mom study. So as we can see, we had 10 main questions from the stigma, and we can see that the highest frequency was, can you see I hope you can see this, but it was COVID and not being able to take care for their children, so number 10. And the lowest reported frequency was COVID and deportation. So the responses range from a 1 to 4 scale, being I am not worried at all for number 1, and I'm worried about this all the time. If we combine all the stigma responses, we can see that there was a 1.75 overall mean, which shows that there's moderate amount of stigma overall of these items. And I can talk about all the other ones, but so one was, how is COVID being treated by family members outside of the household? COVID and family activities, COVID and social gatherings, religious activities, deportation, family member being deported, losing your children, losing your healthcare benefits, finding a job in the future, and not being able to take care of your children. So this second table, I decided to compare the HIV study versus the mom study. So this first column is the HIV study, and it's the people that reported any stigma, so not specifically related to HIV, while this middle column is specifically for HIV. So I used the middle column to compare it to the mom stigma column, and I just put the 3 questions that overlap with our mom stigma study. So we had excluded from social gatherings, excluded from family activities, and religious activities. So the highest one was being excluded from family activities, and the lowest was religious activities. And although here for the HIV study, it's not necessarily a really high percentage, it still is based on their sample size. So their sample size was way bigger than ours. They had 486 participants that responded, and we had 164 participants that responded ours. So they're kind of similar, and they show that there exists a relationship between the stigma associated with both HIV and COVID. And other items that I looked at for the HIV study that are interesting to note is the being gossiped about was really high for the HIV study. So they had a 29.2%. And the lowest one, like I said, was excluded from religious activities. This can also be attributed to the fact that, like I said, the mom stigma is anticipatory versus the HIV stigma, which is already associated with something that happened. So they already had HIV. And this final table shows all my correlations with my psychosocial factors. So as we can see, they were all relevant. It was positively correlated with depression, anxiety, and discrimination, and negatively related to acculturation and years in the US at baseline. So what this shows is that the longer the people were in the US, the less likely they would experience stigma related to COVID. This shows that we do definitely need more healthcare interventions in order to tackle this problem. And then for my open-ended questions, Like I said, I analyzed two main questions and I picked some of the most powerful quotes to me. People responded, "We are being afraid of being sent home to die. I'm worried about my children's emotional and mental health. If something happens to me, where will they be? I don't want to die and for them to be alone, and that my child stays in this country alone." So for these open-ended questions, we had 14.6% of the women out of 163 saying they fear getting tested or seeing a doctor related to COVID because of the family documentation status. And then in a follow-up open-ended question, 18% of this women were who responded that question and gave us some of these quotes. So for limitations to my study, it was really hard to compare to other existing studies since COVID is a fairly new disease. There's not really any other studies that have compared both HIV and COVID, which was the reason why I decided to use a similar study but only looked at HIV. A lot of our participants did not respond to all of the survey questions. We don't really have an explanation for that, but that's how it happened. And it made our sample size a bit smaller compared to theirs. And the survey, once again, was conducted in the early months of the pandemic. So we didn't know what their experiences would be like if they had had COVID. So future research, since this is an ongoing research project, the Women of the Month study will be surveyed again in the upcoming months. So we will be able to switch from the stigma scale to the actual stigma scale. And future research should also investigate the association between the stigma and the COVID-19 vaccine, because there exist anti-sentiments about getting the vaccine in Latino communities. So this could be a really important topic to look at. So in conclusion, my research showed that stigma based on experiences of Latina women during the COVID-19 pandemic are similar to those living with HIV, and that depression and anxiety were associated with stigma among Latina women. And that's all I have. I would just like to thank a couple of people. So thank you to the Anthropology Honors Program for giving me the opportunity to conduct this topic. Involved in the project, the participants, so the moms, and the people in the HIV study, to my mentor, Dr. Nan, for her support and patience in my writing process, to my thesis class peers, and to my family for their encouragement, and to my community college, because it was there where my passion for anthropology began. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Irene. Fantastic job. We do have time for a question or two if anyone wants to pose a question for Irene. You can either put in the chat or raise your hand. Okay, I think people need some time to reflect on that as well, so we can move on. Can you stop sharing? Thank you, Irene. We'll go on to our next talk now, which is Chantel Rabe, who is going to speak about analyzing clinician views on race and genetic ancestry, our second biological anthropology talk. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm going to try to keep my video on, but sometimes my internet cuts out. So just let me know. Okay, can you all see? Oops, I'm not at the beginning, so.
You can see it.
Okay, great. So hi everyone, as I said, my name is Chantel, and I'm really excited to be here and share what I've been working on for my honors thesis. My faculty mentor is Dr. Amy Nan, and for my honors thesis project, I analyzed clinician views on race and genetic ancestry when treating hypertension. So some of the primary questions we considered were, how do clinicians use genetic ancestry when it's presented by a patient? How do clinicians follow guidelines with binary racial categories when treating a patient of mixed ancestry? How do they use race in a clinical setting? And how do they assign and define race? So for this project, we decided to focus on hypertension because it's a racialized disease with race-specific guidelines for treatment. Hypertension is the #1 disease responsible for racial disparities in mortality rates, and it's found in 39% of Black individuals compared to 29% of white individuals. And race-based guidelines for hypertension date back to 2010, but most prominently, the American College of Cardiology's JNC8 guidelines provide race-specific treatment plans for hypertension in Black versus non-Black patients. Specifically, the JNC8 guidelines advise against using angiotensin converting enzyme inhibitors or angiotensin II receptor blockers for monotherapy in Black patients. So basically, they advise to use thiazides or calcium channel blockers for Black patients, whereas non-Black patients, they say that you can also use an ACE inhibitor or an ARB. The supporting literature behind these guidelines, however, is controversial and has had many critiques. So the JNCA guidelines, as I said, they have a lot of limitations. Some of these include that the guidelines don't account for mixed race individuals and they assume strict binary categories. Additionally, there's smaller variation found in drug response between Black and white individuals than within either group. And also there may be other environmental factors contributing to this difference that have not yet been studied. Some of the potential consequences of these guidelines, they may be reinforcing bias, and they also can influence the inappropriate use or avoidance of medications when treating hypertension. So this can affect medication efficacy or medication adherence from patients, among many other things. So I'm now going to get into the study design, and I'm going to start by introducing our study participants. We interviewed 21 clinicians that practice general family medicine at UCSD. We collected various demographic data from these clinicians, and of the clinicians that we sampled, 52.4% reported as male and 47.6% reported as female. It can also be seen that 50% of the clinicians self-reported their race as white, 40% Asian, and 10% declined to state. Additionally, on the right, we can see the range of age and experience of the clinicians. So their age ranged from 29 years all the way to 71 years. The average was 43 years of age. And then their years in practice ranged from 1 year to 40 years with an average of 11.86 years in practice. So for this study, we created 2 different mock patient cases, and they were designed intentionally to have somewhat surprising ancestry results that were not expected given the phenotype of the patient. This allowed us to see how the clinicians handled the conflicting data. So the clinicians were interviewed with, the clinicians that were interviewed were presented with video cases of either a self-identified white or mixed race patient with early signs of hypertension. And as you can see here, the phenotypically mixed race patient had 15% African ancestry, while the phenotypically white patient had 53% African ancestry. And the clinicians were also asked open-ended questions about the use of race-related information and genetic ancestry in clinical decision-making. So how they define race and general perspectives about the role of race and ancestry in medicine. So we took the interviews and transcribed them and then corrected them closely for any mistakes. The transcriptions were then coded in order to find common themes from the open-ended questions asked. So the photo here shows a snip of our code book, and basically this is the codes we came up for defining race and genetic ancestry relevance, and the code book specifies for what and how coding is to be done. So now I'm going to be discussing some of the findings from this project. We first asked the clinicians in their own words to describe the case that they were shown based on the video clip, and their answers were categorized as race-related or non-race related based on whether or not, if they mentioned race, then it was categorized race-related. If they only mentioned other factors, then it was non-race related. So a typical non-race related response from a clinician was Sounds like a 35-year-old previously healthy female who's coming with concerns of elevated blood pressure over the last 2 months. And it doesn't sound like she has any significant, well-known family history for it, but no other risk factors, anything in her diet or lifestyle, or anything that would point to the reason behind this type of pressure. And then a typical race-related response, the clinician says, well, so it seems like some of the cases, or at least the takeaways that what I'm supposed to have taken are that this is an otherwise healthy 35-year-old, partially African-American female of mixed race who is coming in with a new diagnosis of isolated systolic hypertension and has been advised by lifestyle changes. So for that first question, those are two pretty general responses. The clinicians, the breakdown of the clinicians' responses are shown in this graph. So 6 out of 22, or 27.3% of the clinicians mentioned race in their initial description, while 15 out of 22 did not make mention of race. And then 5 of the 6 who mentioned race in their description were shown the patient case of the phenotypically white patient who had 53% African ancestry. This may indicate that this was more unexpected by the clinicians. This question may also indicate which patients considered race in their initial decision making. And it could also be that clinicians felt discomfort mentioning race until further prompted. So in addition to the last finding that I presented, I'm going to talk about how some of our clinicians exhibited feelings of uncertainty in regards to the patient's mixed race. So I've provided 3 examples here. One clinician states, am I going to act on the fact that she's over 50% African ethnicity? I don't know. More just that I don't know what I would do with that. Does the fact that she's 53%, does that even matter clinically? Another says, I'm aware of the guidelines. I guess I don't. If she had presented as being a typical African American, I would have started thiazide. Yes. Would I have started a combination? I would probably not have. I probably would have looked at her kidney function before I decided on an ACE. And then my last one here says, yeah, so she says she's 53%. So I guess, is she African American? Is she African descent, or is she white? So clinicians are not sure how to use this data, and there's not a clear understanding of how ancestry should have clinical relevance. And it's clear that the clinicians really struggled to determine where the patient fits within the categories that are set by these very strict guidelines. And it's also interesting because clinicians generally are not given ancestry data from a patient in a clinical setting. So they typically diagnose based on self-identity or phenotype. However, in some cases, having the ancestry data led them to changing their decision. And in some cases, it didn't. But it generally just makes me question the necessity of the guidelines, as clinicians are typically incorporating other factors as well. And then the last thing that I wanted to touch on is basically guideline adherence in general. It was really challenging to quantify which clinicians were actually following the guidelines in practice. While many clinicians stated that they do follow the guidelines to some degree, understanding these responses was complicated by some of the reasons that I mentioned below. So some of the clinicians followed the guidelines, or at least expressed that they did, but then also noted that the same medication would have been chosen regardless of race. Additionally, many clinicians contradicted themselves or expressed uncertainty throughout a single interview about their medication choice or about whether they do follow the guidelines. And most clinicians also incorporated other factors besides race and genetic ancestry into their decision making. I also hypothesize that there may have been pressure for the clinicians to say that they do follow the guidelines when they were presented them, which may have biased their answers, because some of them often wouldn't remember the guidelines to a T, but would still say that they do follow them when asked. So it's unclear. And in conclusion, clinicians inconsistently are following race-specific guidelines for patients, especially with contradictory genetic ancestry data. This points to the challenge that comes when presented with patients who do not fit these binary categories that the guidelines have set. And more research is needed to be done to determine if there's truly a significant difference in medication response between Black and non-Black patients, and what treatment would be best when you're dealing with mixed race patients that don't align to those set categories. Additionally, the necessity of the guidelines should be at least reconsidered or researched further, and how these guidelines have an impact on mixed race patients specifically. And all race-based guidelines and algorithms that are in medicine should be researched further to ensure racial disparities are not being exacerbated by the implementation and maintenance of these tools. So that's all. Thank you. I want to thank my mentor, Amy Non, along with Carolina Lopez, Sam Struley, who all have continue to help on this project and make the research possible. I'd also like to thank Carolina Hayes, who helped design the study and get IRB approval, and the clinicians who participated in this study, and finally the UCSD Institute for Practical Ethics, who awarded the pilot award which funded this study. That's all.
Thank you, Chantel. Terrific job. I'm sure that sparked a lot of questions too. Very thought-provoking talk. Thank you. We do have time for a question or two, and I see one from our librarian, Karen. Her question, I'll just read it here. Do you know about the new NIH All of Us research program? And if so, how do you think that that might impact this issue of binary race decisions?
I'm actually not very familiar with the All of Us program. If anybody could quickly summarize it.
Could you jump in and explain?
Sure, happy to. It is a new program, and I really didn't expect that you would be there, but they're trying to recruit over 1 million patients of diverse backgrounds to create a database that will help them learn about biology, lifestyle, and environment, and and its effect on health. And so they're trying to build that knowledge base that is not that binary, hey, you're African American, although you might have, 3 or 4 other ethnic backgrounds in your makeup. And so they're trying to answer that question. And so this was just to see if it had popped up in your research. They haven't produced much yet, so they're still in the recruiting phase.
Got it. Thank you for explaining. I absolutely think that would help, because I mean, right now when looking at home ancestry tests, they're very biased towards the people who are able to complete those tests, and that's where they're getting their data from. So it's very like European centric. So I think it's really important, and hopefully that does lead to, a focus on environment and lifestyle rather than using race as a proxy for these ideas.
Great, thanks, Chantel. I'll just pop in and say I also have heard a lot of criticisms of the All of Us program, and I'm not as optimistic as Karen in that it might solve these problems, but we can look into that and think about it further. David, I see you have a question. David Jordan.
Yeah, I'm an All of Us subscriber and enthusiast, and I signed up as soon as it was available on the UCSD campus. One of the things they asked is, how much do you want to know about the genetic background? And I figured, oh boy, free genetic testing, terrific. I'm all for any kind of free medicine I can get. But they apparently based it on, I don't know, a very small saliva sample or blood sample or something that they took when I originally signed up. And I got back the result with lots of disclaimers saying, do you really want to know this? A lot of people don't want to know this. You probably don't want to know this. I think probably I would advise against your knowing this. You really don't want to know it. And I said, all right, tell me already, what is it? And it was sort of a one-liner. You have lots of European ancestors. This was not, I mean, is this what people pay their $100 for when they send it to ancestry.com? So I'm dubious, either they're not getting very much information, or they are so bound in by restrictions about what somebody will consider politically incorrect or dangerously invading privacy or something. I'm not sure they're going to be able to do very much. It's wonderful to have a huge sample. That's marvelous. But I just kind of question whether it's got the detail that's going to be useful.
Chantal, do you want to respond about the usefulness of ancestry testing in general?
Yeah, I mean, I feel like in general, there's still so much. I mean, a lot of the clinicians thankfully also stated this, but there's a lot of questions surrounding like what you could do with it and the accuracy. And I feel like it's very similar to your experience and where you're getting, okay, I'm European. I probably knew that. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just also say, like, you can get a little more fine-grained than that now with the hundreds of thousands of markers, but with the confidence set at higher levels, there's not much more you can say besides European. So you can adjust the confidence interval at 23andMe at least, around which they give you the results. And if you're willing to accept lower confidence, you can find all kinds of countries that you come from. But if you want to be really strict in your criteria, Ancestry doesn't tell you as much as you might expect. And in the clinical realm, it's not being used at all. Right now, it seems from what we saw, but it's interesting how if people do bring it up, clinicians don't know how to use that information. And there's no guidelines on that yet. So, okay. One more thing, Karen said she's currently planning an event at the library with the All of Us program, tentatively set for this fall, to talk about some of the ongoing research projects. That will be interesting. We'll keep an eye out, let us all know when that happens. I think we need to move to the final presentation, or final two presentations, which are our archaeology talks. So we can come back to questions on this one at the end if we have remaining questions. So let's shift gears again and move to our first archaeology talk by Anne-Marie Wart, and she's going to talk about healthcare provisions in Peruvian trephination. And if you are not speaking right now, please mute your microphone. Thank you, Rachel, for helping me mute. And we'll shift to Anne now if you want to share your screen and test out your microphone. Thanks, Anne.
Okay, can you all hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. So, as Professor Nan said, I'm Anne-Marie, and I'm going to be doing my presentation on healthcare provisions in prehistoric Peruvian trephination, assessing healthcare provisions and their influence on long-term survival after trephination. And my mentor for this thesis was Professor Goldstein.
Hey, Anne, you're a little quiet. If you can speak closer to the microphone or speak up just a little more. Maybe it's just me.
Can you hear me better?
Much better.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah.
Okay, I guess I just can't use my headphones then. Okay, warning, pictures of human remains shall be shown during this presentation. If it makes you uncomfortable and you choose to leave, no harm, no foul. I know it's not for everybody. Okay, so when conducting my thesis, I had 3 research goals in mind. The first was to obtain qualitative data from bioarchaeological specimens. The second was to highlight how healthcare provisions affect survival after trephination in Peru. However, due to the scale of my thesis and the availability of data, I was only able to focus on 2 sites, Cinco Cerros and San Damian. And the third was to draw attention to indigenous Peruvian medical knowledge and practice. Okay, so what is trephination? Trephination is the surgical removal of a rectangular, cylindrical, conical, or circular portion of the cranium through cutting, scraping, grooving, and drilling. Peruvian trephination, however, is very special. This is because patients were able to receive trephinations much larger than the ones conducted in Europe and survive even longer after surgery. Peruvians also had a high survival rate, long-term survival rate. To put this into context, around the same time Europeans were having a long-term survival rate ranging from 30 to 50%, prehistoric Peruvians were having a long-term survival rate of 78.1% within the Southern Highland region alone, and similar percentages throughout the country. However, when discussing this phenomenon, researchers tend to cite anatomical knowledge and method of trephination as the cause. I argue in my thesis that this is not the case. In modern medicine, after a person receives an invasive surgery, they need post-operative care from doctors, nurses, family, and friends to become rehabilitated and live a good life after surgery. This would have been the same, if not even more important back then, and I feel like researchers overlook this factor. Okay, so before I can dive into what I actually did, I need to address two things. The first being the person who created the collection in which I study. For my research, I used refined crania, quote, recovered by Alois Hrdlicka for his collection titled the Hrdlicka Paleopathology Collection. This collection was created in 1913 for the 1915 Panama, California exhibition. This collection was created in the goal to highlight indigenous diseases and surgery in Peru. Hrdlicka himself is a controversial figure in anthropology. Not only was he a firm eugenist, but he also conducted his work in obtaining bioarchaeological specimens almost as if it was a scavenger hunt, with very little record keeping or respect for the dead and the communities in which these remains came from. This led to a lack of records detailing not only cultural association, but skeletal association. Sadly, this practice was commonplace at the time and has significantly affected not only the study of this collection, but other similar collections as well. This then leads me to discuss my own ethics that I used within my study. The first is that I did not deal with the actual physical remains due to changes in guidelines at the Museum of Us, the collection which hosts this collection. I only used a published catalog from the 1980s, that just contained photographs, pathological descriptions, and location of recovery. However, even though I only worked with published material, I tried to treat each crania I studied as an individual and treat them with the utmost respect. Okay, the second thing I have to mention is Cinco Cerras and San Damian. You heard me mention it a bit earlier. These sites are the sites at which I chose to study due to the amount of trephined crania in the collection being from that region. Overall, there were 81 trephined crania throughout the entire Hrdlicka collection, and 59 of those 81 were from Cinco Cerros and San Damian. These sites are located within the Huarochirí province within the Lima district of Peru. Sadly, my map making skills are not the best, as you can see on the screen. But the most important thing you need to know about these two sites is that they were only 10 miles away from each other. Cinco Cerros is within the yellow circle, San Damian is within the red. That is about a 2 to 3 hour walk in between each other. And so that's relatively close. So I decided to lump these two collections together when analyzing. Due to the lack of cultural association, it is unknown if the trephined crania collected from these sites were pre-Inca or Inca in date. It is known through an historical document titled the Huarochirí manuscript that before annexation into the Incan Empire, this region was comprised of loosely kin-related Aleuts that lived on hilltop residences and were primarily self-sufficient. Archaeological work in the region focusing on Incan expansion shows that this region maintained, continued its local practices with the implementation of some Incan practices. So they were relatively unchanged in the region. It's due to this unchanged nature that I believe the healthcare practices wouldn't have significantly changed in between pre-Inca period and Inca period. So that's one thing else to keep in mind. So what exactly did I do? Well, my research was two-phased. The first was a basic statistical analysis of the trephined crania within the two regions. However, for this presentation, I'm going to be focusing on what I did in the second part, which was the index of care. This is where I analyzed 3 crania that I thought best represented the trephined crania from Cinco Cerros and San Damian as a whole. Through the Index of Care, which is a web-based software developed by Lorna Tilley as a tool to formulate qualitative data from bioarchaeological remains, which follows her bioarchaeology of care method. Now, I must note this is titled an index, however, you don't really index anything. There's no numerical value given for a specimen having a pathology or not. It's just a 4-step process. The first is to diagnose and describe any pathologies or injuries an individual might have. The second is to determine if this individual had any disability due to said injury or illness. The third is to determine what care could have been used in the acute and long term. And the fourth is what interpretation can we get from the individual about the community. Okay, warning. I will be showing now the skeletal remains. So for this presentation, I decided just to show you guys one individual who I analyzed in the index of care, which was specimen number 19152-258. Okay, so what do we know of this man? Well, we know this person was an adult male who underwent 2 trephinations, though it is unknown if they were done at the same time. These trephinations were located in the frontal region near the glabella and in the posterior right parietal region. We also know that this individual showed signs of long-term healing. As you can see right here, this little white, I don't know if you guys can see my mouse moving, but this white border is an indication of remodeling. That is quite a bit for cranial remodeling. Cranial remodeling does not go at the same pace as bone remodeling in the long bones. And then similar in the back, in the posterior one, you can see there was significant remodeling. This indicates that the individual did live for a long period of time after receiving this trephination. Also, in that the trephinations themselves were quite large. This individual also showed signs of temporomandibular osteoarthritis, tooth loss, alveolar absorption, and abscessing, all which are non-lethal and could be tied to malnutrition. Okay, so due to the cause of trephination in Peru being related to cranial trauma associated with warfare, I think it's safe to believe this individual was either rendered immobile or unconscious before, during, and after surgery for a period of time, not just because of medicine to conduct said procedure, but just because of the sheer size of the injuries themselves. It's also probable that this individual suffered from a traumatic brain injury or TBI. However, the extent of the TBI is unknown due to the individualistic nature of the injury, and any evidence of the injury would disappear as the soft tissue decays. Though, through the location of the trephination, it's possible to argue that the individual might have had some difficulties with cognitive processing, executive function, and emotional function for a period of time. And later difficulties with independence and communal reintegration. However, I must note that when analyzing this individual, I took a very conservative approach. Effects of TBI can vary greatly and can be much more severe, such as seizures, which would have created a need for much more intensive care. However, due to the situation surrounding the remains and the collection itself, I thought a conservative approach would be best. So, how did they care for these injuries and disabilities? Well, in the short term, it wouldn't have been so different than what we do now. This individual, or the individual or individuals who were in charge of our injured care would have just basically conducted rudimentary care, such as surgical site maintenance, nutrition, probably through a liquid diet, and hygiene to reduce the risk of infection and keep the individual alive while he was unconscious or immobile, until the patient was able to take care of himself. Again, a long-term care would also kind of be similar to what we do today, but would be more reflective of their small-scale society or relatively isolated province. They would have had to help facilitate rehabilitation into society and accommodate any differences in ability, personality, or temperament caused by the TBI, which would have led to a communal shift in labor if the person was not able to do certain jobs to make sure that this member was a functioning member in society. So, what does this all reflect on the community in which this person lived? Well, the care demonstrates a collective knowledge and understanding of the importance of a clean environment, and mitigation of acute risks after trephination. And just due to the amount of trephinations we could see in the region and the amount of long-term survival, not only seen within the Huarochirí province, but in Peru over a long period of time. This knowledge indicates that the care associated with these injuries and cranial surgery were practiced not only in a singular community, but in multiple communities, and were passed down generationally as time progressed. The first trephinated crania, or the oldest trephinated crania found in Peru, is dated to be 400 BC, and trephination continued all the way up to when the Spanish met with the Incas. We also know that this individual lived many years after, well, from the remodeling, we can assume that this individual lived many years after their trephinations. This then means that he was a functioning member of society or held some sort of importance. Though the exact details of how the community responded and interacted with this individual is unknown, it's clear that the community was socially sustainable for the injured. My best interpretation and what I believe is that if this individual was a protector or warrior before being injured, since there is that connection between cranial trauma, warfare, and trephination, this individual would have gone back to being in that role, not only because of any temperamental differences, because typically TBIs and temperamental changes tend to have an increase in aggression. So any aggression then could be shifted towards outside enemies, not so much internally towards the community, but also any knowledge in fighting and warfare wouldn't have been lost. Though it is possible this individual could have just gone and been a herder or done household chores. It's just without the rest of the skeleton, we have no occupational markers. Okay. So why is this important? The trend in Peruvian trephination research is typically focused on quantitative data because it doesn't require any cultural or skeletal association. However, I believe that even though we lack cultural and skeletal association, we can still gain insight into ancient Peruvian knowledge by studying the specimens through a qualitative lens, especially since there is no first-person written record about this practice. Also, when it comes to discussing early forms of surgery, especially a surgery as complicated and invasive as trephination, the focus tends to be on Western civilizations. However, the Peruvians were more successful than any other civilization in having a long-term survival, and I believe that knowledge is not discussed enough, and it should be. So thank you for listening. I want to acknowledge Professor Goldstein and Professor Nahn for helping me throughout this entire project, the UCSD Honors Thesis Program, and my classmates for giving me the opportunity and being my comrades in this, and my family for really being my rock throughout this entire thing. So yes, thank you.
Eleni's about to start. Yoko.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you, Anne. Terrific job. Really fascinating stuff. We have time for a question for Anne if anyone wants to raise one now. But we can also open to the whole cohort. And sorry, let me mute whoever is speaking. There we go. Okay, so also, I guess I would also say thank you to all of your families who are here today, maybe the ones who haven't stayed on mute. I know that you guys supported these students, especially since they've been doing all their work from home, a lot of them in this remote environment. So thank you to the families who supported all of the great students that spoke today and who are here today. And great job, terrific talks by everyone. I wish we had even more time, but let's open for a couple of questions if anyone wants to ask questions to any of the speakers now. You can ask them, raise your hand, or put them in the chat.
Is Eleni going to be giving her talk?
Oh, sorry. Yes. So thank you, Anne. We forgot. I'm so sorry. Yes, Eleni is our last speaker. I missed it. Thank you, Anne. So Eleni, sorry, I have your slides up. And I know that you're having technical difficulties. So we will, I'll advance the slides for you. Are we able to hear you?
Yeah, or I hope so.
Great. Yes, we can hear and see. So sorry.
Is this loud enough?
Yes, you're loud
Okay, cool.
and clear, and we can see you well.
Okay.
Okay, so let me just share my screen. So sorry, I almost skipped your talk. Okay, so we'll save the questions after Eleni's talk, and I will go into presentation mode for you here, and you can just notify me when you want me to advance.
Okay.
Okay, you can go ahead and get started. For our final talk today, let me introduce, Eleni Carwin, who's going to speak about environmental and human interaction in Dor's Middle Bronze Age to Iron Age period lagoon, Carmel Coast, Israel. Welcome.
Yes. Yeah. It's a bit of a mouthful. But yes, hi, my name is Eleni Carwin, and today I'd like to present the data from my research project, mentored by Dr. Tom Levy, where I studied the environment and human interaction of an ancient lagoon in Dor in Israel through sediment core analysis. Next. This project would not have been possible without the support of several organizations and institutions. Firstly, I would like to thank the UCSD Anthropology Department for giving me the opportunity to perform this research as a senior honors project. I'd also like to thank the Scripps Center for Marine Archaeology, and especially the Deep Sea Core Drilling Lab, and Dr. Gilad Steinberg for supervising my research and guiding me throughout this project. I'd also like to mention the important partnership with the University of Haifa and the Leon Recanati Institute for Maritime Studies, providing me with the opportunity to analyze the core from Dor. And this partnership combines the goal of advancing the study of climate and environmental science by using the extensive archaeological database of the Eastern Mediterranean. This kind of, you can go to the next one. This begs the question of why looking at an old tube of dirt is important for people, the environment, and the interactions between them. So, paleoclimatology is the study of ancient climates based on markers of change that are left behind in the form of chemical, physical, and biological proxies. These proxies reveal information about the environment at a point in time through various mediums like ice core analysis, palynology, and the one which I used in this study, X-ray fluorescence analysis. By linking these contexts together, we can form a holistic approach to reconstructing the environments of the past over various geological and cultural periods. The advantage to this is especially important today as we're also seeing cycles of sea level rise and the future threat to many coastal cities. And here on the image on the right, I'd like to provide like a recent affiliated example that also answers the question as to why study climate change. The highly publicized mega tsunami paper by Steinberg and Associates, published in 2020, just recently, studied the core of Dor D4, which highlights the occurrence of a catastrophic tsunami based on the analysis of the stratigraphic record. So with the collection of sediment cores and data from other previous coring research at Dor, it becomes easier to paint a picture of the morphology of the location. Next. So now I'd like to look a little bit at the regional setting and the study location. The image on the left shows the Eastern Mediterranean Sea, and indicated by the arrows is the Nile littoral cell, which transports sediments in a process called longshore drift from the Nile Delta, and it deposits sand all along the coast of those arrows. The geology of the coast of Israel is specifically at Dor, allows for the preservation of the sediment record due to sandstone cliffs, locally called Kirkar, which run vertically parallel to the coast. And in the gaps and troughs between these ridges, they collect sediment and preserve the stratigraphic archive. Similar to the movements of sediment along the Levantine coast, Historically, this corridor has seen the movement of people out of Africa and spreading up into Eurasia. Because of the human migratory pattern, the sustained occupation since the Neolithic, which is like 11,000 years ago, and the location in an area which has seen world-changing advents such as agriculture, pottery, and metallurgy, Israel highlights an important region to study anthropologically. And shown on the right is the location for the research team's previous boreholes as circles. Those were collected in 2019. And the core that I worked on, NW4, is indicated as a triangle. NW4 fills a gap in the current data as the top lithological units are more protected from wave energy disturbances, because as you can see, it's more inland than the core of D4 and shows a clear picture of the deposition that occurred following the drying of the wetlands and the increase of the sea level during the Holocene. So basically this means that the energy from the shore somewhat disturbed the sediments of D4 and disrupted the stratigraphic record, whereas in the core that I was looking at, it is a bit more preserved and allows us to look at more units. So next one. There are several layers in the core which are consistent across drill locations and can be linked with one another as distinct conforming layers of stratigraphy. So this means across cores. There are changes in the deposition patterns across previously researched cores like D4 and NW4, but the same layers of wetland clay sandwich a silty sand layer, which suggests continuity of the units. So in the picture, you can see this indicated in my core NW4 by the bottom 3 units, the 2 brown boxes, which sandwich that yellow box. And then on the image on the right, like the very bottom right, it's really hard to, or it's kind of hard to see. Maybe go like the central column that has yellow on the top and then 2 gray, yeah, that one. So the corresponding units in that one are the 2 gray boxes with the stripe of sand in between. So basically using the same layers of wetland clay, it suggests that we can relatively link the timeline of these cores together. But previous cores, while helpful for dating and linking, like I said before, were located closer and experienced the disturbance. So the units overlying it are mostly just coastal sand and do not reveal any more information about the established Holocene marshy wetland deposits or the overlying layers. This leads to the question of what does the sediment core tell us and how the lithostratigraphic units, the morphology and the evolution of the embayments at this coast of Dor, as well as the transformations both influenced by natural and potentially human processes, how they affect the coast at this location. So you can go to the next one. And I'm now going to present a little bit more information about the core NW4. So working back from the sediment core, we would be able to predict what coastal processes were going on and infer whether those are man-made or natural based on archaeological evidence and predicted sea level changes and the proxy XRF data in this case. So these are intensity curves, which are readings from the XRF machine. A very brief explanation of how the XRF works is it shoots X-rays at a specific location along the core, and depending on the element and the intensity of the ray, a certain reflection coefficient will bounce back, and you can analyze that to see the intensity of the element at that specific location. So these proxies can be used in many different ways, and titanium, for example, is often used to indicate aeolian flux because it's found in dust commonly carried by wind as a coating over clay or an embedding. Aeolian means wind-related sediment. And if you look at the intensity curve for titanium, you can see that in layers that I have described as more silty and clayey, there are increased levels of titanium intensity. So for example, we can see in the very dense clay units of F1 and F2 and F3, there's pretty high intensities, whereas compared to a unit like F8, which is established as just coastal sand, there is an obvious lack of titanium because there is no clay in that sediment. Calcium and silicon are good indicators of sand because calcium comes from shell particles and silicon comes from quartz. And if we look at both of these, they show very similar curves, also highlighting the coastal sand unit of F8. You can see a spike there, and then you can also see a dip in the more clay concentrated sediments, which leads me to the next proxy, which is iron. And that one is commonly used as an indicator for clay sediments because it bonds to the finer particles and conforms it. It's pretty much an ideal way to correlate the sediments to an actual clay deposit because it's one of the most reliable ways. And essentially, boiling down all of these curves, it supports the narrative that there were periods where finer sediments could deposit without getting swept away by high energy conditions of direct wave erosion from the sea. And we can go to the next one. Okay, these are elemental ratios, which are used in, well, it looks kind of weird for some reason. Sorry, phone glitch. Okay, so the the ratios are used as a way to calibrate for the abundance of calcium and silicon. So we can use these ratios to get a better idea of the actual amount. Although one downside is you can't tell which element is acting on the other. So these kind of support the previous findings, and I'm going to kind of rush through this part. So go to the next one. Let's see. There's been a lot of research at DOR about the cultural periods, and we're starting to build up a bigger narrative. But one of the most robust hypotheses was proposed first by Avner Rabban, and it detailed the possibility of an embayment or an anchorage in the South Bay of Dor in 1987. He proposed that a lagoon there was first used by the Sea peoples, the Sikali, and then successively by following inhabitants of Dor. And he suggested that the bay began about a mile south of Tel Dor near the Tantura Lagoon. And his vision of the anchorage extended upward as a corridor, and it ends up where there's modern day fish ponds. So in the images that I have here, on the right is an artist's interpretation of Rabban's proposal for the morphology of the Bay of Dor for at least some period of time. And then on the right, you can see a more zoomed out image that has the fish ponds, which extends to like the hypothesized location. And then the bottom image is the cores again, so you can kind of imagine how those cores would be located in the illustration. The one thing that you can't see that is very important and that I would use my mouse to go over, but I'm not sure if you can see it, is On the image on the right, you can barely see it, but on the left side, it says rock cut passage. Yeah, right there. And this rock cut passage is very important because it's an example of a human made change on the environment that also has an effect on later deposition of sediment. So in this example, Raban uses this rock cut passage to support the presence of an embayment because he proposes that humans would have had to cut a passage into this rock to let the sediments that were trapped in this embayment out to allow for to allow for boats to go into this area. And then the last thing is pretty much in the location where those boats are drawn on the illustration on the right, there has been found many shipwrecks in this site, which further suggest the location of this embayment and its possibility because of the proximity of all of these boats to the coastal ridge. And then next. So the last, like the future of this project could be in the further analysis of the sediment core using different methods like grain size analysis or maybe optically stimulated luminescence or carbon-14 dating to help solidify the timeline of the lagoon and to determine with certainty the lithology of the units. Based on my interpretations, I suggest that after the wetlands of the mid-Holocene, the area of Dore has gone through morphological shifts, starting from a terrestrial coastal area about 6,000 to 4,000 years ago, caused by a period of drying, which is shown in layers F4 and F5, to a natural bay lagoon, which was first proposed by Raban, which is supported by layers F6 and F7, to an anchorage, which is supported by the purely coastal layer of F8, back to a natural bay, which are the layers F9 through the topsoil. So that is my interpretation of core NW4. And I thank you for your time. And I would like to thank Dr. Nan a lot for helping me out with this really weird technical snafu, but thank you.
No worries. Great job, Eleni. And especially impressive as I know you're viewing this only on your phone and you're not seeing the slides right now. So really excellent. Okay, awesome job, everybody. Thank you to the audience for sticking with us through all of these fantastic talks. I'll just take a couple minutes for questions and then we will jump to the awards quickly. So are there any questions for any of our speakers? I know it's been a long morning. Let me stop sharing the screen. I did that. Super interesting, Eleni. Lots of great congratulatory comments throughout the chat window. So I'll just start with one question for Eleni. Can you just give us, like, in your own words, what do you think is like the most important thing we can learn from this core? Or is there anything you think would advise us about climate change that is relevant to like other regions of the world or the future of this planet that we can learn from a core like this?
Yeah, I think something that I didn't really get into too much is the anthropogenic influences on coastal processes. So something as small as putting in a breakwater, like horizontally out from a coast, changes how the sediments deposit, especially if it was coming from the south, like from the Nile. That means it would deposit in a certain way and change like the formation of the cove. So especially in a time where there's so much development and the fact that like roughly 60% of the world's population lives on a coast, even though geographically it's only 0.3% of the world's surface. It's very important to look at coasts because they have the most robust archive of like geomorphology, I guess. And we definitely, kind of evidenced by the mega tsunami paper, especially with the large and unpredictable changes in climate, it's important to look at how ancient people reacted to these unexpected events or how they interacted with the environment.
Thank you so much. Really, really helpful. Thank you. Any other questions for Eleni or any of our speakers? I'll pose one more for the group as a whole, that maybe anyone can jump in who wants to speak. Just curious if any finding you learned from your thesis is like motivating you to carry forward into a new project or into a master's project, as many of you are going on to master's degrees, some of you are going on to PhDs. I'm curious if any of your findings sparked like a new interest or a follow-up study for any of you.
Well, I definitely had some questions after the end of my project, and in my PowerPoint, I did get a chance to present it, but I feel like a lot of the research could have been refined if someone had actually done like statistics and like demographic research and like actually surveying believers and asking about certain preferences versus just, you know, asking them general like interview questions. So that's something I may want to explore in the future.
That's great. Thanks, Sophia. Anyone else?
I guess I can speak for a bit. I really found interest in the bioarchaeology of care and index of care while doing my research. I found it very fascinating. So that's something that I'm going to be hopefully taking over to my master's program when I go to do it, because that's what I'll be working on over there. So yeah, that's what I'm gonna carry over, and hopefully I'll be still within South America, but I really just want to use that method.
That's great. Thanks, Anne. I think it was a really interesting method too, because like you mentioned, very little research has been done thinking about how people survived and how they were helped to survive. And that's what's so interesting about the trephination and understudied. Chantel, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was gonna say something too. Sorry, there's a siren in the back. I also like had so many more things I feel like that came up during my project, and specifically like one of the things that I was thinking about is all our clinicians are from UCSD, so they're in La Jolla, and a lot of them don't see a lot of African American patients, and I would love to like interview clinicians that do, because I feel like their responses would be a lot different. They'd probably be more aware of the guidelines, and I'm curious if that would mean that they use them more or use them less. So that was just one of the things I thought about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. That would be really more interesting. David? Jordan?
Is Sophia Reyes still with us?
Yeah. Oh yeah, I am.
Oh, okay. I had a question about Santa Muerte, because I'm interested in the division of labor among these various saints. People have been dying all through history, so that doesn't explain why there's so much interest all of a sudden in Santa Muerte. You wouldn't pray to Santa Muerte to have, I don't know, children, I don't suppose.
No.
All of your examples had to do with death.
Yeah.
And protection against particularly only violent death or any kind of death. Would you pray to Santa Muerte if you had cancer, say? Or would that be something that you go to another saint for? She's part of a pattern of saints, I guess, and there's a division of labor among them that may not be very strict, but it's a fascinating cult, but it's in interaction with all these other cults.
No, I agree, and it's good to see you again, because I took your Aztec seminar my freshman year. I don't know if you remember me.
I'm going to give it again this fall.
It was really
go back to Mictlantecutli. All those texts are still there. You can still read about Mictlantecutli if you want to.
It was really instrumental to just my thesis formation and just my general field of study. But I do agree with you. There is a division of labor. It's really interesting because in a lot of the documents of the ethnography where people did worship multiple saints or they self-ID'd as Catholic, there was mainly like a trio and that was Santa Muerte, La Virgen, and San Judas, St. Jude, who's the patron of desperate causes. So when you mentioned the example about cancer, a lot of people with so-called like incurable illnesses will petition San Judas or La Virgen for generally like acts of physical healing. Whereas for Santa Muerte, it's more protection from violent death. And it's much more secular in that like, oh, please don't let me lose my job, or please don't let me be killed at my job. Where San Judas and La Virgen have more of this sort of transcendental, like spiritual healing that also corresponds with the
I've always had a
physical.
sense that Santa Muerte is also where you go if you're not a worthy enough person to go pray in a church.
No, I agree with
And
that.
I'm taking that
It's
from
like
a
a
Chinese perspective, because there are little Chinese deities that are for unrespectable people who turn out to be mostly criminals and prostitutes and actors somehow. But
No, I agree. There's a really Desiree Martin, who I used a lot of her ethnography. She wrote Legal Marginalizations, where it talks about how Santa Muerte has been historically used by like underclass people. And that's why also the state considers her dangerous, because some drug cartel leaders do pray to her to evade the law. Where, and then the slide that I wasn't able to, that I had to skip was about her non-judgmental qualities. So one of the main reasons why women and even people who are sort of on the margins like her is that she doesn't judge you. Like you can request anything from her, and unlike La Virgen or unlike a canonical saint, she isn't going to say like, oh, I can't fulfill this. Like, for example, there is an example where if you ask her to like kill somebody who's harmed you, she won't necessarily do it, but she will fulfill the request if she feels like that person has wronged you. So she's like a very amoral like type of justice that doesn't fall in line with like the Christian ideology where like pray for your enemies and have like sympathy for those who harmed you. So she's very empowering to people who typically don't get justice, you know. But.
Thank you.
Thanks. That was great. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen now, and I know we've been here a while, so I'm gonna quickly announce some of our awards now. If you still have some lingering questions, you can feel free to enter them in the chat. And if any of the students want to address any of the questions in the chat, you can go ahead and enter them in the chat. Okay, so let me just turn on presentation mode and we will, can you guys see the screen okay? Yes, okay, thanks. Let's shift to our first award. So I want to congratulate everyone, first of all. These were really, like Shirley mentioned, among the best talks I've seen of undergraduate students in my years here. And so I'm just really proud of everybody. I wish we could give every single person an award, but we can't. So I would if I could. These are the ones that we've selected as a faculty based on all of your grades, your performance in classes we've taken, your thesis as well. Not everyone that wrote a thesis, everyone was considered. So for our first Washburn Award for Excellence in Biological Anthropology, I want to just mention quickly, Sherwood Washburn was a really important figure in biological anthropology, an early advocate of the field of study of comparative primate behavior, an important student of extinct hominids, and of comparative primate anatomy. And this year, our Washburn Award for Excellence in Biological Anthropology goes to two students who had the highest grades in the biological anthropology program as well. One of them wrote a thesis, and they are David Mazaros and Carolina Rosa. So congratulations to both of you in biological anthropology. I should have notified them both. They're probably not here. We'll have to notify them later, but congratulations to these two students for their excellent work in biological anthropology. Our next award is the Adams Award for Archaeological Anthropology. I'll quickly say Robert McAdams was a former adjunct faculty member here at UCSD and an important comparative archaeologist of early state formation, a pioneer in the study of broad regional systems. This year, our award in archaeology goes to Anne Marie Wart. And I know, Anne, you're a biological anthropology major, but I felt your thesis was archaeological in nature. So we decided to give you the Excellence in Anthropological Archaeology Award. So congratulations to Anne. Okay, our third award is for the Hallowell Award for Sociocultural Anthropology. Irving Hallowell was a cultural anthropologist, one of the founders of the field of cultural anthropology and personality, and a pioneer in the cross-cultural use of psychological testing. I'd like to give this award to 2 recipients this year. We're going to jointly award. We could not choose. These 2 recipients gave incredible efforts in their thesis, incredible thesis talks and writing, and they are Mariana Gomez Hernandez and Michael Murphy. Congratulations to both of you. And then finally, actually not finally, we have 2 more awards. One is the Spiro Award for Psychological and Medical Anthropology. So Spiro was an American cultural anthropologist specializing in religion and psychological anthropology, and the founder of our anthropology department here at UC San Diego. This is just our 4th year granting this award, and this year it goes to a student who stood out in psychological anthropology seminars, Owen James, and also he's probably not here, so we'll make sure he is made aware of this. And we'll send all of you certificates. And I forgot to mention $75 award gift cards to Amazon as well. Okay, so one more award. I'm so sorry Shirley had to leave because as a surprise to Shirley, we have decided to create a new award in honor of Shirley and of our new major in climate change. So we have a new Shirley Strum Award for Conservation and the Human Predicament. And also because we have a new major in our department this year, and this is our first time graduating students in the major of climate change and human solutions. So the first inaugural awardee of this is one of our top climate change graduating students, and that was Sophia Silvestri. Congratulations to Sophia Silvestri. And also, I wanted to just read through the names of all of the students this year that completed their honors thesis. And this is the time, if we were in person, I would personally invite you up and hand you a certificate and give you your honors cords. Hopefully all of you received your honors cords in the mail, or you were able to pick them up from the bookstore, and you can wear them at the graduation ceremony if you attend in person. So congratulations to Eleni, Carwin, Tianquang Chen, Yereni Reyes Medina, David Mazzaros, Michael Murphy, Mariana Gomez Hernandez, Eduardo Pavez Berrios, Chantal Rebe, Sophia Reyes, and Anne-Marie Wart. You all wrote excellent theses, and I'm very proud of you. So finally, also, congratulations to all the majors that are graduating this year, in addition to those of you I just mentioned that wrote theses, all the students that are graduating this year who completed all their coursework in a pandemic. Kudos to all of them. That wasn't easy. I also want to thank everybody in our department who helped the undergraduate education succeed this year and every year, including our mentor protege program. I know a lot of you took part in that and had graduate student mentors. Dylan Hollingstead O'Brien, our graduate student who directs this program, and all the graduate students who helped mentor the undergraduates this year. Our anthropology club, who was recently revived, that kind of fell apart in the pandemic, and Michael Murphy, one of our thesis students, brought it back to life as the president this year. So thank you, Michael, and all of the elected members of our anthropology club. I've listed here too many to name. Thank you to all of you for bringing our passion back into our undergraduate anthropology students. Thank you to all the staff who helped with undergraduate issues, including Rachel Brand, our undergraduate advisor. I think she had to leave, but thank you, Rachel, and Nancy Lee, who helps with everything, and Debbie and Erin in Global Health, who also helped, and Sophia, our student worker, who helped with all student worker needs. So thank you to the staff, the librarians, all 3 of you who I invited to my classes, Sarah Cataluba, our anthropology librarian, Karen Heskett, our medical librarian, Stephanie Lebu, our data science librarian. I also want to thank all the lecturers, including mostly our students, many of our students, graduate students who taught anthropology undergraduate courses, and graduate students who were teaching assistants for most of our undergraduates who took courses this year. And some of you here speakers today were also TAs for some of our courses. So thank you to everyone who helped with undergraduate teaching. And the final thing I wanted to just say was I asked some of our last year's alumni who graduated from our thesis program to send me some comments about how they're doing. And they all sent personal congratulations to this year's graduating class and to you guys who are here today. I took little snippets of the long things they wrote to me. I hope I can put them on our website somewhere. They're all doing great. They want to share their success with you. They're all either starting PhD programs or master's programs or physician's assistants programs, finishing AmeriCorps service, or in the middle of writing a master's thesis in linguistics. They're all doing great. They all said that this honors thesis program helped them tremendously prepare for whatever they ended up doing, and the value of anthropology in whatever they ended up doing was very evident, and they're grateful that they got an anthropology degree and that they did an anthropology thesis. So hopefully all of you who spoke today will stay in touch, and we can reach out to you and see how you're doing a year or 2 or 3 from now, and you'll have similar success stories to share. I know you will, because many of you are already planning great careers in academia and beyond. So congratulations. Gonna stop talking. Let's just give one more round of applause. If you guys could unmute yourselves and everyone could hear. Or maybe not. Okay, I'm going to open the chat window quickly to see if there's any other final questions. Everyone's just saying thank you. Thanks to Dylan. Thanks to all the TAs and faculty and librarians.
I think we need a round of applause to thank Amy.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hooray for Amy. Amazing job.
Thanks. I want to say, I think this year you guys did so fantastic. And one of the reasons is that I encourage you to do original research, which we haven't always encouraged in the past, because it's difficult to generate data, analyze real data that you have generated or others have generated. And you guys did it, even though it was remote. Pretty much all of you analyzed original research and contributed original research. And I'm just really proud that you managed to do that in a pandemic. So congratulations again. Yeah. Okay, I think we've held you here long enough. Anyone wants to stick around and chat, you're free to do so, but our ceremony is over. So thanks everyone for coming. I'll stop recording. Thanks everyone. Fantastic job, guys. Really proud of you.